when we're looking at the AC. Then we have the lower order concern, which is the grammar language referencing. And today we're doing grammar and language, and we're going to hopefully do referencing next week. Now, lower order concern doesn't mean it's not important. It's just about when you proofread your work and edit your work, you want to focus on areas that will give you more marks, which is usually the content and the structure. However, as we mentioned in the previous workshop, your grammar and your language can move you from an A grade to a B grade, a C grade, or a C grade to a B and C, right? So it's equally important that you write in an academic manner using appropriate grammar and appropriate language. Now, when we look at grammar and language, there's certain things that we're going to take into consideration. First, we're going to look at the main standards in English, which is the American and the British English, because most often you write and you stick to one of these two. Then we're going to look at punctuation in grammar. We're going to look at different kinds of punctuations like your comma, your semicolon, your colon, your full stop, hyphens, and dashes. Then we're going to look at capitalization. We'll look at the use of articles, and then we'll end off by looking at academic language. So when we talk of language in academic writing, what do we refer to? What should we focus on? As we always do, if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me at any time. You can ask in the chat. Alternatively, you can raise your hand to ask a question. I will provide my contact details for the presentation to be emailed should you want it. The recording will be made available after 7 working days, and you can send an email to Mr. Kagiso. I'll also provide his email, or if he's here, he will provide his email in the chat. So please again note, there are workshops, but there's also one-on-one consultations, which you can book through Mr. Kagiso. In one-on-one consultations, I help you with your specific assignments. And that session is just you and me. And I help you with any aspects of academic writing, how to unpack your questions, brainstorm. I can look at your actual writing, depending on what you need. All right, let's dive in. Let's start with the difference between grammar and language. So when we talk of grammar, thank you, Mr. Kagiso. He has put his email in the chat. So please save that email should you want to book for one-on-one consultations. When we talk of grammar, we refer to the structure and system of a language, right, in general. So it usually consists of the syntax, which syntax we mean the sentence structures and how sentences, function in how words relate to each other. Syntax is sentence structures, and the morphology is how words relate to each other. So when we look at grammar, we look at words and we look at sentences. So how do words form sentences, and how do sentences relate to each other, right? Then the language, on the other hand, when we talk of language, is really a form of communication. So grammar falls within language, right? So a specific grammar is based on a specific language, right? So language is more general. So it refers to human communication. So how words are structured. So the conventional ways of speaking, the conventional way of speech, of writing and gestures. So in academic writing specifically, when we talk of language, we want to look at, how formal is your language? Do you write in a formal way? Do you write in a way that your message is easily understood? When the reader reads, can they understand what you're saying? And so on. Do you write in an unbiased manner? Is your language supported by facts, or is it emotional, right? So we're going to look at these different aspects when we look at the language. So in the presentation, grammar will look at sentence structure and punctuation, while language will focus on the tone and the register of your academic language. So this is, because grammar and language really consist of a lot, today's presentation will focus on these 4, right? So for grammar, we'll look at sentence structures, punctuation, and for language, we're going to look at the tone and the register of your academic writing work. Now, let's begin with the difference between the American and the British English. Now, these are the two main standards. This means if you're writing in English, you can either write using the American variation or the American standard, sorry. There's two standards and there's many variations, right? So in English, we have two main standards. And please don't get bored already that this is some kind of history, but it's important because this will determine the way you edit and proofread your work, right? So in English, there's two main standards. It's the British English and the American English. Every other English are what we call variations of these main standards, right? So for example, the South African variation, the Nigerian variation, the Kenyan variation, and so on, right? The Australian variation. Australian variation, for example, falls under the British English, right? So you will see that the South African variation as well falls under the British English. You have other variations that fall under the American English. So what is important for us to note today is that our variation, the way we write or the way we should write our essays in South Africa falls under the British English. And these two standards are different from each other in terms of, number one, spelling. You will see that the British English, for example, words like anemia is spelled with AE, but in the American, it's spelled with E. This means if you're writing your AC, you need to spell anemia with ANAE. If you spelling words like cancelled, in the British, you will use double L. With the American, you will use one L. With the British words like fulfill, you will use one L. In the American, you will use double L. Color, you would have noticed that sometimes you read articles, color is written with COLOUR, but sometimes it's written with COLOR. So the difference is one is the American standard and one is the British standard. Now, what is important is consistency. You cannot switch between the American and the British. To help you, if you type in your assignment, just go on your Word document and ensure that your language, it's either South African English or British English, right? Most often the word automatically will choose the American English. So you have to go to your settings and ensure that it's British. If you do not do that, what will happen is it's going to highlight all the British spellings in red, meaning it's wrong, which is not wrong because it's the American standard. So it's important that you check your settings, right? Let me just make a note if we have time. I will share my screen and show you how to check the settings, but please, you can also remind me towards the end to please show you on Word document where you need to pay attention to change your setting to either choose the British or the South African English, just so that it doesn't highlight the British words as wrong spelling just because it's the language of editing is American, right? All right, let's continue. So also in terms of vocabulary, there's differences between the two. For example, in the British, we'll say trousers. Americans will say pants. Flat and apartment, bonnet and hood, boot and trunk, lorry and truck, university. In South Africa, we mostly say university. But the same thing we consider university in South Africa, in the America, they mostly call it college, right? The British English will say holiday. The American English will say vacation. Jumper, sweater, trainer, sneakers, and so on. And you will realize that with some of these words, we use it interchangeably because it's sometimes acceptable in both standards. But there is a difference, right? Because English is really flexible. Now, there's also some grammatical differences when you choose the British or the American English. For instance, in the American English, collective nouns are singular. So in the American English, we'll say the band is playing, right? But in the British English, collective nouns can be singular or plural. So for example, you can say the band are playing, right? So another thing is the British mostly uses formal speech like shall, whereas American prefer, will and or should. Americans, however, continue to use gotten as the past participle of get, while British have stopped using that, they just say got, right? And so on. So you see that there are some grammatical differences. Now, although there are differences between these two, what is important is for you to be consistent, to choose one specific standard and stick to it, especially on your Word document, just so that some words are not highlighted in red when they're actually not wrong, right? So this is just to draw your attention to especially how words are spelled differently in these two standards. I'm sure you've also seen words like capitalization with a Z and with an S, right? In South Africa, you will use an S because we use the British standard. All right, so it's the same English, just with some little differences. All right, while we have brought that to your attention, let's dive into grammar. Now, when we look at grammar, punctuation is extremely important, right? Sentence structure is important, but with appropriate punctuation, your sentences can even be well or more well presented. Now, when we look at punctuation, the most common punctuation is the comma, right? Because even the full stop is less common in the sense that, within a sentence, you can have two commas, for example, and end the sentence with a full stop. So it's the most used punctuation, but also the punctuation that is most misused. So during this workshop, I want you to pay attention to when I say common mistakes that students usually make. Note that, right? Because that is what you should pay attention to so you don't make the same mistake, okay? So the first use of the comma is the use of a comma after introductory words or introductory sentences. Now, when you'll see sentences like, however, the reporter did not interview any students. The introductory word here is however. Words like hence, moreover, furthermore, in addition, all of these are words, introductory words that introduce a sentence before the sentence is constructed, right? So with such words, you need to put a comma. However, comma, moreover, comma, in addition, comma, similarly, comma, consequently, comma, hence, comma. Then we have what we call introductory phrases and clauses, right? After this, you also need to use a comma. For example, because of this, comma, the article was biased. Now, the introductory phrase here is because of this. Then we have, although the students were unhappy, comma, they did not complain. The introductory sentence here is, although the students were unhappy, right? Because Queen is very happy, she went jogging, right? So the introductory sentence here is because Queen is very happy. Then even with the introductory sentences, you have certain words that also guide you that this is going to be an introductory sentence. Now, I want you to note some of these words. Most often, when a sentence begins with because, it will usually follow, it's usually an introductory phrase that should be followed by a comma, right? Another example is sentences that start with W-I-T-H. With the rise of technology, learning has become easy. You will see that with the rise of technology is the introductory sentence. Then we have more sentences that begin with while. W-H-I-L-E, while. Most sentences that begin with while also indicate an introductory sentence. For example, while I was at university, I had many friends. Okay. Then another one that can also guide you are things like as, right? Most sentences that begin with as indicate an introductory sentence. As the students were going to school, they found gold on the street, right? Again, that introduces an introductory sentence. So if you already know some of these words, that when a word starts with this, it's probably going to be an introductory sentence. This again will guide you to be able to easily identify an introductory sentence. And there's more, right? Which we cannot unpack everything today, even when, for example, sentences that begin with when also indicate introductory sentences, right? So let me see if I can post some of these in the chat for you, just so that you can have more of these examples, because as I said, this is the highest use of the comma. We also have even if, we have when a sentence starts with even if, we have when a sentence starts with based on, we have when a sentence starts with using, right? Let me copy paste that by. Sentences that begin with by usually also introduce introductory phrases. Okay, so I'm just going to copy some of these examples and put them in the chat for you, so that you can have that for future references. It's difficult. We cannot exhaust the list today, but we will try to give as much information as possible. But as I always say, when it comes to academic writing, it is a process, right? So the more you write, the more you will begin to understand how to use your comma. Now, the next comma is a comma for what we call, the next comma is the comma for what we call interrupting phrases, right? Now, interrupting phrases, this is when you use a comma for information that is not necessary. Now, let's say not necessary for the sentence to make sense. So you want to add information, but the information is really not relevant for that sentence to make sense. The sentence will still make grammatical sense without that specific information. So what you want to do then in such an instance is to include that information that can be taken out in between two commas. Okay, so another thing that could guide you for interrupting commas is any information that you think you can include within parentheses. Now, parentheses is those two brackets, you know, the round brackets, the round ones. The square ones in the British English is mostly called brackets, and the round ones are called parentheses. So if you think that specific information you can include in parentheses, then that information can also be included within two different commas, right? So those are our parentheses, the round ones. So let's have an example of such an information. That student, John, was very helpful today. Now, what I want you to do is to read this sentence again without John and see if it makes sense. That student was very helpful today. The subject is student, the verb is was, and we have the object, right? Helpful. So you see that if we take out John, this sentence will still make sense. The reader will still be able to understand what the sentence means. Mrs. Smith, the new sport teacher, showed us a new technique. Now read the sentence without the new sport teacher. Mrs. Smith showed us a new technique. John, who has just been made a student counselor, is presenting his speech at the assembly. Now you will see that who has just been made a student counselor is additional information to really explain who John is, but it's not necessary for that sentence to make sense. It still makes sense even if we take out that information. That sentence makes grammatical sense because we have a subject, a verb, and a predicate, right? The third one is a comma used for listing, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with this specific punctuation, right? When you use a comma to list different items. The comma is mostly used to list short items, while the semicolon is used to list sentences or independent sentences or longer items, right? So, for example, the reporter interviewed teachers, parents, and members of the community. Now, what you need to note is sometimes there's two different ways. With most grammars now, you have to use a comma before listing the last item in the list, but it's not necessary. It is also acceptable to not include a comma. If you will include a comma, then it's important that you do it consistently before the last item of the list. Okay? Any question regarding the comma? The next, also when listing, you can also use a comma to list two adjectives. So you do not only use the comma to list items in a list, but you can also use the comma to list adjective or more adjective in a sentence. For example, that students move slowly, quietly, and carefully. Can you see now here there is a comma before and, right? I specifically prefer to use the comma before the last item in the list. The student was bright, cooperative member. So you see that when listing adjective and adverbs, you can also use a comma, not just when listing items. Now, the main thing to avoid with the comma, or the main problem that is found in students' work, is what we call comma splices. Now, please take note of this, because this is what is common with students writing, comma splices. So a comma splice is the wrongful use of comma, which has turned out to be, from practice or reviewing students' work, the comma splice has turned out to be the major punctuation mistakes in most students' work, right? So a comma splice is when you use the comma wrongfully. And usually when you use the comma wrongfully, it means you were either supposed to use a full stop, a semicolon, or a coordinating conjunction, right? And I'm going to explain this in more detail. Let's have the example here. We need to leave, comma, we are going to be late. And just yesterday, I was reviewing a student's work, and I realized again that the comma splice is the highest, it's the highest mistake in, or was the highest mistake in that specific student's work, because it's so easy for us to use the comma when we want to pause, but pauses can mean full stop. It can mean the end of one idea and the start of another. Now, what should guide you is a comma should not, and please note, a comma should not be used between two independent sentences. What is an independent sentence? An independent sentence is a sentence that stands on its own. So a sentence which has a subject, a verb, and an object, right? So subject and predicate. Predicate is that part of a sentence that has the verb and the object. So your sentence needs to, once your sentence makes complete sense, it should have a full stop, a semicolon, or a conjunction. Now let's look at the examples. The example here, we need to leave, we are going to be late. Now this is two independent sentences. If I say, Precious, we need to leave, that is a full sentence. If I say we are going to be late, that is a full sentence. We being the subject, going, are being the verb, and being late being the object, right? So how was the student supposed to write this sentence? There's three ways to fix the comma splice. A full stop, we need to leave, full stop, we are going to be late. So breaking it up and making two full sentences. The second way to fix the comma splice is the semicolon. I've just sorry, I'm trying to put the semicolon in the, that's the colon, sorry. And this is the semicolon. It's refusing, it's just automatically, my computer is freezing. Sorry, guys. Okay. So the colon, please note the difference between the colon and the semicolon. So the semicolon is the one with the full stop on top and a comma at the bottom. That is the semicolon. And the one with two full stops, that's the colon. Okay. So to fix the comma splice, you can also use the semicolon. We need to leave semicolon. We are going to be late. The last way to fix the comma splice is by using coordinating conjunctions, right? So we need to leave or we are going to be late, okay? So if you happen to have a sentence that makes sense, instead of joining two sentences that already make sense, it's important that you separate them using a full stop or a semicolon or a conjunction. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to post in the chat our conjunctions, coordinative conjunctions, so that you know what they are. It's not a lot of them in English. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 coordinating conjunctions. So it's easy. If the sentence is full, it's a full sentence, but you want to make it a complex sentence, that is, you don't want to end the sentence, you want to continue the sentence using appropriate punctuation, you can then use your semicolon, or you can use a comma and the coordinating conjunction. Okay? Okay, let's continue then. The semicolon. The one with the dot and a comma at the bottom can be used in 3 different instances, same as the comma. Now, one thing to note with the semicolon is that the semicolon should be used to connect two balanced sentences. Please highlight the word balance, right? It should be used to connect two balanced. Balanced sentences are the same as complete sentences. So I'm going to be using this interchangeably today, right? I'm going to be using this interchangeably today. So I'm going to be switching between balance and complete to mean the same thing, to mean a sentence that has a subject, a verb, and a complement or an object. So a complete sentence, a sentence that makes sense on its own. So let's say you have 2 sentences, they are both complete, but you want to show that strong relationship or strong connection between the 2 sentences, then you use your semicolon. For example, John was unhappy with his results. He knew he didn't prepare enough. Now, if you say John was unhappy with his result, that is a sentence on its own. You can't put a full stop and say he knew he didn't prepare enough. But you want to show the strong relationship between the two. That is why you're using a semicolon. Also, you don't want your work to have choppy sentences, which I'll explain further in the grammar section. So that is why you want to use complex sentences. And complex sentences imply, semicolons, commas and coordinative conjunctions, extensions, additional information using interrupting commas. So you don't want your sentence, your work to be full of short sentences. You want to have short sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences. So sentences that, are formed by maybe 2 independent sentences, or sentences that are formed by 1 independent and a supporting clause, right? Those are your compound sentences. The other way you can use the semicolon is before connecting word. So for example, the research was generally informative. However, a key idea was missing. So usually when you have a connecting word like this, you will see that you can use a semicolon, and a comma. First, we address the issues that had already been listed. Then we moved on to new ideas and strategies. You see that the connecting word is then. So the only difference between the first point and the second point is that with the second point, these are both balanced sentences, but with the second point, you use a connecting word or your linking word to kind of show the relationship between the two. That's the only difference. Again, you can use the semicolon and a comma after the connecting word. Then the last one, just like the comma, for listing, you can also use the semicolon to list. The difference is mostly use the semicolon to list independent phrases or longer phrases, right? Even if they're not independent, but they're long and difficult to understand, then you can use the semicolon. For example, I read the research paper on snakes in Australia, one about Queensland crocodile, one that I really didn't understand about lizard, and the one about conversations of reptiles, right? These are longer sentences that could make sense standing on their own. So you can list ideas, longer ideas using the semicolon, not the comma. Mostly use the comma for shorter items.
Excuse me.
Next one is the, yes.
Excuse me, ma'am. Are they
Yes,
not?
I can hear you.
In the session, you don't have notes.
Pardon?
Because I'm asking that in the session you don't have notes because I don't see notes in my screen.
There are. I'm reading through a PowerPoint slide. Anyone else that cannot see my slide? I'm on the colon slide now. Please just indicate with a thumbs up if you can see my slide. I'm on the colon slide. All right, Karabo, this has happened before. Others can see the slide. This has happened before. So what you need to do is you need to maybe try to sign out and sign in again. That usually resolves the problem.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Colons. Now the colon is the one with the two dots, and usually, sometimes students make mistakes between the colon and the semicolon and use it interchangeably, but these are two separate colons. And please, it's important that you know how separate or how different they are, right? We've seen how the semicolon is used, which is the full stop and the comma at the bottom, and the colon is the two full stops, right? So the semicolon, as we have seen, is used to join two independent sentences and can be used to list independent ideas, and can be used, in between two independent sentences just before a connecting word. The colon, on the other hand, is used to introduce more information and can be used to also introduce a quote, right? A direct quote. So a colon is usually used in instances like this. Please bring the following item to class: colon, your homework, diary, a notebook, your pencil case, and your textbook. The instruction said, colon, connect part A to part B. So you see that the colon is used to introduce more information or to introduce a list. Now, the common mistake with students, or that students make, is using the colon after words like such as, including. Now, you shouldn't use a colon after words like such as and including if they come after a complete sentence. So you can't use them if it's not a complete sentence. But if it's a complete sentence and at the end you list in such as, you do not need to use a colon, simply because these words already indicate that a list is to follow. When I say such as, it means a list is to follow. But if I say the instruction said, it doesn't really indicate a list is to follow, so I can use a colon. But when you use such as, including, at the end of a complete sentence, you do not need to use the colon. So that is what you need to note when it comes to the colon. Another thing you need to note when it comes to the colon is how to capitalize. There's a lot of mistakes around this. Some people get confused. When do I capitalize after a colon? Right? So when to capitalize over a colon? When you introduce a list of things, do not capitalize. Now, if we go back to the example we had here, if you check, bring the following items to class, your homework, can you see it's not capitalized, right? However, if you are introducing a full idea, that is, the sentence that comes after a colon is an independent sentence, same as balanced sentence or complete sentence, right? Just so you don't get confused. Balanced, complete, independent sentences, they all mean the same. So if you are, after the colon, you are indicating a complete sentence, you need to use a full stop, just as you can see on the slide. When to capitalize before a word after a colon, you see that because the sentence that follows is a full sentence, can you see that it's in capital letter? When a colon introduces a phrase or an incomplete sentence that is meant to add information to the sentence before it, do not capitalize it. Same like this, right? This is to add, if we go back, the instruction said connect part A to part B. This is adding additional information, so you do not need to capitalize it. However, when do you also capitalize it? If after the colon you're using a proper noun. So proper nouns are names of places, people, and things, like the University of South Africa, South Africa itself, right? Kenya. These are proper nouns. So if they come after a colon, they will maintain their capital letters. Okay. So what is important also is that you need to be consistent in terms of your capitalization. All right. The apostrophe. Yesterday, as I was reviewing the students' work, the student really struggled about knowing when to when to use the apostrophe for plural and singular nouns. And that is the difficulty when it comes to apostrophe, or where students mostly get confused. So what the apostrophe? The apostrophe is that punctuation that is used to show ownership. You know, this one. That one, the one with some kind of a dot and like the comma on the opposite side. Let me type that in the chat. My drawing is not, the computer is somehow slow. I think it's the internet connection, because I'm working from the office and sometimes the internet connection is not the best at the office. It's best at home. All right, so let me just show you Queen's book. Queen's book, right? So you will see that the apostrophe is to indicate ownership, to say that the book belongs to Queen. Now, the main challenge with the apostrophe is when it's for plural. So when the book belongs to more than one person. So for example, Queen and Ashley's book, right? Still, when it's Queen and Ashley's book, the apostrophe, if it's one book, the apostrophe will come after the last name. So it's going to be Queen and Ashley's book. If it's one book that belongs to both Queen and Ashley. If it's separate books, so one book for Queen and one book for Ashley, then we can say Queen's apostrophe and Ashley's book. All right. Now, if the word is plural, so student's book, a student's book, the apostrophe is after student, but student's book, the apostrophe is after students. Let me write that down. It's difficult when I'm saying it. Just give me a moment. I'm typing that. So if I were to say the student's book, referring to one student, it's going to be written like this, the student's book. But if it's many students, so it's going to be the student's book. You see that the apostrophe is after the S. Then the other thing you need to note is if a name already has an S, you do not need to do this. This is wrong. Okay, what I'm doing right now is wrong, right? Louis' book. Please check the chat. That is wrong. You do not do that. If the name already has an S, you do not need to add another S. So you just say Louis' book like that. Okay. So you see the examples we have as well in the slide, competitor strategy. So it's many competitors. So the apostrophe is just after the S, right? Teacher's lessons. When you see the apostrophe after the S, it means that it's many teachers, right? The other thing to note about the apostrophe, the use of the apostrophe indicates ownership, whereas just adding S indicates plurality. Now, sometimes students just add S to indicate belonging, but if you're indicating belonging, there has to be an S. And if you're indicating plurality, you just add an S without the apostrophe. There's been instances where the students added an apostrophe S to mean many. If you want to indicate plurality, so many, just add an S without the apostrophe. Okay. Again, as I said, what is important with this workshop is please note when I say the current or the recurrent mistake on students' work. Because when it comes to grammar, theory is too dense. I'm going to walk you through a lot of theory today, right? And it's difficult to remember all of this. Malangu, I think it's difficult when you sometimes come into the workshop, the slides are not showing connectivity issues. So if you were to sign in and out, you may be able to then see the slides. I don't know if Karabo is back. Karabo, are you back with us? My computer is so slow. It takes so much time just to check those who are present. Okay, Karabo has not signed back in yet. I wanted to ask if she's then able to see the slide. Mlangu, try signing in and out again. And please, if you come back, just let me know if you can see the slides or not. Karabo is not back. I hope she's able to come back or to sign in again. All right. The full stop, right? We all know that after the sentence, when the sentence ends, we need to include a full stop, right? The full stop indicates that the sentence is complete and it has come to an end. And one thing to note with the full stop is that there always needs to be a space after the full stop before you start the next sentence, but not before, right? Sometimes students make the mistake to put the space before the full stop. The space comes after the full stop. As you can see the example, I finished my report. Full stop, there's a space. It took me a long time to edit. Okay, so when it comes to the full stop, really the main thing to note is, you use it at the end of a sentence. So a complete, balanced, or independent sentence, that's when you use the full stop. But a complete balanced sentence can also be ended by an exclamation mark, which is really not that much used in academic writing because exclamation marks really indicate emotions, as we're going to see. But a question mark can also be used at the end of a sentence if you're asking a question. But at the end of a plain sentence, you will use a full stop, which I've already introduced. The question mark is used when you're asking the question. Now, the common mistake is that sometimes students use the question mark when they're not asking a direct question, right? I was trying to find out whether the students were angry. Would you use a question mark for this sentence? I was trying to find out whether the student was angry. Is that a question? Thumbs up if you think it's a question. Thumbs down if you think it's not. I was trying to find out whether the student was angry. Correct. That is extremely correct, Ashley. It is not a question. Now, sometimes the use of how, the use of whether in a sentence, sometimes students get confused to think that it is a question, right? It is not a question. That question, it would have been a question if I had said, was the student angry? That is a direct question, right? Was the student angry? That is a question. Okay, let's continue. All right. So a question mark then is used to ask actual question. What is the next class? Where is your next class? When is the assignment due, right? What is the assignment's due date? So you use the question mark to ask questions. Then the exclamation marks, unlikely use in academic writing. Now, guys, please pay attention. With essays and most academic writing, that is from literature reviews, report writing, research proposals, essays, short answers, most often avoid the exclamation mark. The exclamation mark is usually used to show an emotion or a feeling about something, a person, or an event. So it also, can demonstrate excitement, anger, surprise, for example. How exciting, yuck, I can't believe this. Now, what you notice about this is that this is an informal tone of writing, which we'll see in the language section. It's informal to say yuck in your academic writing, or to say, I can't believe this. Number one, there's a contraction. Number two, you're showing emotions. And with academic writing, you want to avoid showing emotions. You want to be factual and objective in the way you write, which we'll see in the second part of our workshop today, which is language. So usually you hardly see exclamation mark in students' writing, except the exclamation mark is used within a quote. So you read an academic journal, or you went on the field and you conducted questions or interviews, and these are actual responses that students made. So you're taking that direct quote and including it as reference in your work. Then you do not change it. That is when you will really see the exclamation mark. So by extension of others, not really you expressing those emotions. Okay, so that is one thing to note about the exclamation marks. Then we have ellipses. Just like exclamation marks, use ellipses when you want to chop out information in a reference. Now, I'm sure you've done this when you're referencing and what the author says is too long. And maybe what you need is the first sentence, and maybe there's two irrelevant sentences in between and you want the last sentence. But it has to, it comes together. Right? So what you want to do is you chop out those two sentences that you do not want and you put ellipses there to show that you have taken out information. Now, let me type this in the chat. So in a quote, it will usually look like this. The hyphen, on the other hand, is used for compound nouns. So student-oriented, theory-based. So when you want to merge two nouns together, you use the shorter one. It's called the hyphen, right? That is when you use the hyphen. Okay, let's carry on. The prepositions. Now, when it comes to prepositions, it's almost like we say in academic, do not cram, but when it comes to preposition, you've got to know them. There's no other way. It's just like learning a language. You need to know the prepositions. They come together. So the more you read about them, the more you use them, the more you're going to know about the prepositions. We have a lot of preposition, over 150 prepositions in English, divided between your prepositions, your adverbial prepositional phrases, your adjectival prepositional phrases. So there's a lot of prepositions. I have provided a few, which you will go through at your own time, or you can just Google them, or should you request for the presentation, you can use the presentation just to go through some of these prepositional phrases. As you can see online, you can read some of them. some of the prepositional phrases. So these are phrases that really make sense together. For example, I will not say to example. It is said for example. That is a prepositional phrase because it makes sense together, right? It does not make sense independently or with another word. To example, it will not work. It has to be for example. It has to be for instance. It has to be addition to, in addition to, in agreement with, in answer to, right? It has to be demand for, as regards, in practice, preference for, in my opinion, dependent on, strategy for, report on, examples of, importance of, implication of, information about, thesis on or thesis about, in theory. We won't say on theory or for theory or to theory. It is said in theory. You can't change that, right? There's many ways to say things in English, but when it comes to prepositional phrases, you cannot change it, right? You just need to get acquainted, get used to how it is said in English. Karabo and Palesa, I have sent you the presentation because I'm just worried if you're not able to follow. Other prepositional phrases, adjectival preposition, absent from, essential to, familiar with, right? Okay. Next is capitalization. Capitalization is also another important thing now in grammar, when looking at grammar. So you will capitalize proper nouns, and we saw that proper nouns are name of places, things, and people, right? John Smith, that's the name of a person. University of Western Australia, that's the name of a place. So you will use capital letters for proper nouns. I also always comes with capital letter. Now, please note, you never write I with a small letter. And this is really something that specifically annoys your lecturers when you write I with a small letter. I is a proper noun and it's always written with a capital letter. Another thing to note with capitalization is sometimes students use it wrongfully. So, or overly use capitalization. Now, for example, some students will use capital letters for diseases, except the specific disease is named after someone. Diseases are usually written in small letter. For example, you will say Alzheimer disease. Alzheimer is in capital letter simply because it is named after someone. There is a proper noun. But you will say arthritis using small letters simply because arthritis is not named after someone, right? Another thing that students usually overly use capitalization is when students for theories and approaches, right? For example, social just theory, Marxism, and so on. If the theory is named after someone, then it will take a capital letter. But if it's not named after anyone, then it should not take a capital letter. So these are some of the things that are not on the slide because, as I said, when it comes to grammar, there's so much. And as I present, there's some of the rules that I remember that I will share with you, okay? Because, like, for example, what I'm sharing now about capitalization is not on the slide. That is the importance of attending the workshops, right? Because as I present, there's certain things that I remember. Okay, I've just shared the one for diseases, the rule for diseases in the chat. Let me share for you the one with the theory, just in case you're taking notes, so that you can put that in your notes. Okay. I have a Word document of over 15,000 words, which are only grammatical and language rules. So it's really difficult to unpack all in a 2-hour session. That is why writing is a process, right? With time, you fix one mistake and the other, and you keep improving. And some of these are things that you already don't have in your writing. You're good with it. You understand it. So you want to focus on those that you struggle with, right? It's not about knowing all the rules. It's about focusing on areas that you specifically struggle with, okay? Articles. Now we have 3 different articles in English, right? A, an, and the. So when do I use the? The is the definite article usually used when you refer to a specific thing. So you know what that thing is already. Then you can use the, right? THE. For example, get in the car. In this example, the word THE is referring to a specific car. But if you were to refer to something generic, so something you do not know about yet, you can use a or an. A will be used in front of consonants, and an will be used in front of vowel, right? An apple, a car, right? So let's say you're sitting in front of the house and a red car passes by. You will turn to your friend and say, Lungile, a car just passed by, right? But if you were to, if the car passes again for the second time, then you're no longer going to say, Lungile, a car just passed by. You will say the red car just passed again, because we already know which car you're referring to. So that is really one way to differentiate between the definite and indefinite article. So the indefinite usually is the first time you introduce the thing, you use a or an, depending on it being a vowel or consonant, and you use the if it's, not a consonant. All right. Good question, Gwenya. So COVID-19 is written in capital letter because really it refers to the name of a specific virus. So the virus is coronavirus, and you will see that coronavirus is not written in capital letter. So COVID-19 is the name of a specific disease called, coronavirus, for a specific virus. So that is why it's referred to as COVID-19. So that disease was actually named, right? And proper nouns are name of things, events, people, right? So in this case, that specific virus was named COVID-19. That is why you will see it is written in a capital letter. Does that make sense, Gwenya? So the next thing that we need to look at, right, is sentence structures. Perhaps Gwenya is typing. The next thing we need to look at is sentence structures. So from the punctuation, we then have sentence structures. Now, when it comes to the sentence structure, we have to look at what a complete sentence is. Then, what is the main mistake that we usually find when it comes to sentence structures? The first mistake is sentence fragments, incomplete sentences. The second mistake, also very common in students' work, is what we call run-on sentences. And as you will see, these mistakes are directly linked to punctuation. So a complete sentence, as we have seen, is a sentence that has a verb and a subject, right? It has a complete thought. It makes sense on its own, also referred to a balanced sentence or independent sentence. Now let's focus on what or how the mistakes we make with sentence structures. A run-on sentence, did I skip? Okay. A run-on sentence is when you combine 2 sentences without using any form of punctuation. So you just wrote 2 sentences or 3 sentences without punctuation. So common in students' work, you find a paragraph written in a sentence. Not that it's in a sentence, the student did not put the appropriate punctuation. They didn't put full stops, they didn't put, semicolons or coordinative conjunctions. It's just a sentence that runs, full stop in this case, or question marks specifically, because that is how you end the sentence, with a question mark or full stop. So the run-on sentence, you'll see that they use semicolons, commas, or they use no punctuation for a full paragraph. That is a run-on sentence. So when you combine multiple sentences without using appropriate punctuation to end those sentences. So run-on sentences, you can fix it by using a semicolon to separate those two sentences that you want to show strong link between the two, and a full stop. If you think the idea can end and start again, you use a full stop for sentences that are too long, or you can use your coordinative conjunction. So the same way you will fix the comma splice, the same way you will fix the run-on sentence. Okay? And you will see the example there. The research was conducted by an in-depth survey. The results were interpreted by the team. You can see I cannot even breathe, right? The research was conducted by an in-depth survey. The results were interpreted by the team. These are two sentences that have been joined without the punctuation. How do we fix this? The research was conducted by an in-depth survey and the results were interpreted by the team. So you can use the coordinative conjunction. Just a mistake here, there has to be a comma before and because these are two independent sentences. The next thing, the research was conducted by an in-depth survey, semicolon. The results were interpreted by the team. The third one, the research was conducted by in-depth survey, full stop, the results were interpreted by the team. So you see that just like with the comma splice, the run-on sentences can be fixed by the full stop, the semicolon, or the comma and the coordinating conjunction. The sentence fragment is the opposite. With the run-on sentence, you've combined two sentences into one. With the sentence fragment, this is when you write an incomplete sentence to stand on its own, right? So, to be a complete sentence, a sentence must have a subject and a verb and express a full thought. For example, writing the first draft of an AC is a fragment because there is no clear subject or verb. In short, more information is needed for the sentence to make sense. So you could create a complete sentence out of this in several ways. Writing the first draft of an essay is an important step. The tutor is discussing the concept of writing the first draft of an essay. So you see that for sentence fragments, usually you need to add more information, ensuring it has both the subject and the verb for it to form a complete thought. All right. Another thing to note when it comes to sentence structure is the tense. Now you need to be consistent. The mistake students sometimes make here is they're not consistent. You start a paragraph maybe in the present tense and you're reporting in the present tense and suddenly you're reporting in the past tense. The authors mentioned in the article that, and the next reference you use, you say the authors mentioned that, or the authors indicate that, right? So you're moving from the present to the past tense. If you're going to report in the present tense, report in the present tense. If you're going to report in the past tense, report in the past tense. But also there's also shift within sentences. So you need to ensure that the verb tense you use is kept consistent if the time frame is the same. Only shift if the tense is shifting in terms of time frame. So for example, the manager is from Melbourne, but he worked in Sydney. You see that here because you're shifting in terms of time, you can use the past tense. But if you're not shifting, then you should use the present tense, right? So if you say the manager is from Melbourne, but he worked in Sydney for many years, it will be different from saying the manager is from Melbourne, but he works in Sydney. It means that he's currently working, right? But when you say worked, it means in the past he worked. So you see that shifting the tense shifts the meaning. So you need to be careful with that. Word form. Now, another thing you need to note with grammar is the word form. The word form, when we talk of word form, we refer to adjective, verb, adverbs, and so on. So you need to ensure that you use the appropriate one. Now, for example, the manager did not considerate the needs of the employees. The problem is not that considerate is not correct. The form is wrong, right? So the manager did not considerate, right? That is the adjective form of consider. The right one will be the verb consider. The manager did not consider the needs of the employee. So considerate and consider are the same word, but the form is wrong. So please pay attention to the form. The other most common grammatical mistake in students' work is subject-verb agreement. If I say, Ashley and Karabo eat apples. I will say Quinta eats apple, right? So when the subject is plural, the verb usually is singular. And when the subject is singular, the verb is plural. The students are angry about fees increase. The student is angry about fees increase. Queen has a car. Queen and Gwenya have a car, right? So you will see that based on the subject, the verb has to agree with the subject, okay? Another thing is when you're using an all, it all, when you're citing, E-T-A-L. When you're using that, it's the verb that comes after should always be in singular. So, because an all means and many. So you will say Mary and all suggest, not suggest, right? That is a common mistake in students' work. Mary, John, and Peter suggest. So it has to be Mary and all suggest. The World Health Organization argues because it's one organization. But sometimes students think because it's one organization with many branches, they will say argue. It's one organization. It's a single subject. So the verb should be in plural. That is the other mistake that you should, or the other common error that you should pay attention to. And you will see here, when it comes to, singular subjects like everyone, everybody, every student, you mostly use the singular verb. Everybody has, every student has, nobody was, someone is, the group was, the family is, because these are singular, they are considered singular subjects. Then these are considered plural subjects, so the verb will be plural. The students have, the teacher and the student have, both the students have, several students have, a few of the students have, many students need, right? As I said, it's a lot of information, which when you have the slides, you can go through, but focus on those areas that you are specifically struggling with, because it's difficult to really know all of these rules at once. And with time, you will get to know them even better. Then when it comes to spelling, it's another common mistake found in students' work. And the main area where we find mistakes is, for words that are written quite closely, but they mean different things, right? So there, and there, these are three different words, right? But sometimes students use them interchangeably to mean the same thing. There is mostly used as an adverb meaning it, at, or to that place. For example, we are going there tonight. There, on the other hand, is a possessive pronoun for they. For example, I love going to Reds for brunch. Their toast is the best. Finally, there, which is a contraction of they are. Avoid contraction in academics, but there, it's they are so nice, right? It's the short form of they are. So be mindful how you use them. Another thing to pay attention to when it comes to grammar is which and that, right? Which or that can be tricky. We use which when talking about something that is not essential to the meaning of the sentence. For example, our office, which has 2 entrances, is located in Sydney. Here, the clause which has 2 entrances is simply additional information and can be removed without changing the meaning of the sentence. So if you are adding additional information that is really not necessary to that sentence, you can put a comma which. But if you use that, you use that when you're adding information that is essential for that sentence to make sense. So that is the difference between which and that. Which can sometimes be used as well for addition, for important information, but mostly use it when adding additional information. When you use which for essential information, there is usually no comma before which. That is the difference, right? So please note, you can use which for important information, but there will be no comma before it. If you're using it to add additional information, then you will see that you will mostly use a comma before it and or after and before it. Relative pronoun whom or who. When using relative pronoun to refer to people, use the pronoun who. If you can replace the pronoun with he or she, then you can use who. A photographer is a person, right? Who takes photos. So if you can say he takes photos, then you will use who. Use the pronoun whom if you can replace the noun with him. The manager did not know to whom he addressed the question. He addressed the question to her or to him, right? So that is just a trick for you to know when to use who and when to use him. Am I losing you or are you following? Thumbs up if you're following. Alternatively, you can ask the question in the chat. We're going to take 5 minutes break. Lungile, do you have a question? Okay, others are following. I think Lungile is giving a thumbs up by raising the hand. All right. Okay, guys, that sums it for grammar, right? So we have looked at different things to pay attention to while looking at the grammar. Let's have a 5 minutes break and we're going to conclude by looking at language. So when we writing our essays and we're looking editing or proofreading for language, what are the things that we need to pay attention to? Let's have a 5 minutes break. It's 16:34. We're going to resume at 16:40, right? And finish and look at what to pay attention to in terms of language. Okay, as I said, it's a lot of theory. We will have an opportunity to practice with the next workshop. I'll try to give an opportunity to edit some text, especially if we have some of the students that attended the theory. Okay, let's look at academic language. So recap, when looking at grammar, we focus on punctuation, we focus on sentence structures, we look at, spelling. Then it's important that we look at tenses. We look at subject-verb agreement as well. So apart from the grammar, the next thing that we need to focus on is the academic language. Now, with the academic language, there's certain things that we need to avoid and there's certain things that we need to do that are extremely important in our essays. Number one, abbreviations. The first time you write an abbreviation or an acronym, it's important that you write it in full. Then in parentheses, you use the abbreviated form. Then with subsequent use, you can now use the acronym or the abbreviation. I hope that makes sense. So for example, the Committee for Health and Well-being. Let's say the abbreviation is CHW or the World Health Organization. The next time you want to use the World Health Organization, you are going to use WHO, but you shouldn't use WHO for the first time. You will use it for the subsequent times. Okay? All right. I'm not sure if Ngwenya is here. I just explained again in the chat, and I hope that it's clearer. The reason why COVID is capitalized while most diseases are not. As you will see, COVID is, the name of the virus, as I mentioned earlier. But adding to that is the short form of coronavirus disease, which is really the virus, right? CO for corona, VI for virus, D for disease, and first detected in 2019, so COVID-19. That is why it's in capital letter. Okay, I think I received a clap there. I hope it was from Gwenya. I didn't see where it was coming from. Okay, the next thing is contractions. Now, it's easy to say yeah all, right? When you're writing, when you type in those messages, you all. Or to say, isn't it? These are all contractions. Now, guys, stay away from this in your academic essays. Write them in full. Is not, you all, they aren't, they are not, right? So aren't, are not. Avoid all forms of contractions. Write in full. Should not shouldn't. Okay? Those were for acronyms. Then for abbreviations, the same thing. Write them. When you want to abbreviate, let's say the Committee for Health and Well-being. Sorry, I confused a bit. I was a little bit confused with acronyms and abbreviations there. So acronyms are when you, this is when you use the first letters of words, you know, to represent a certain name. So for example, World Health Organization, WHO. But abbreviations, on the other hand, is when, for example, you say the Committee for Health and Well-being, and then with later mentioning, when you mention it later, you can see when I get tired, I fumble a lot. Sorry about that. So when you mention it later, then you will say the committee instead of saying the full name. You can just say the committee. But because you did introduce which committee we refer, yeah, I know, right? What other things should we take into consideration when we look at language? Cliches. What are cliches? Cliches are words and phrases that have been so overused that they lose their power, which can make writing feel, lazy. Some common cliches are think outside the box, going forward, at the end of the day. Now, it's easy to use cliches when talking. At the end of the day, I went to school. At the end of the day, this meant that, But when writing, avoid cliches, right? Replace these words with more precise words or descriptive technology that will lead to more sophisticated writing, right? So instead of saying think outside the box, what are you asking them to think outside the box? Maybe just describe it, For example, thinking outside the box, a more precise way could be in this context, look for better strategies or think for other strategies than those that you know of. But you can say think outside the box, right? So avoid such, be more precise with what you're trying to say in your essays. The next thing is unnecessary language. Some people believe that good writing is characterized by highly complex language and sentences. In fact, this is not the case. It's better to use simple language. When you communicate for someone to understand you. And sometimes people think, or students think, for me to demonstrate that I am an academic, I'm a university, I'm a senior student, I need to use a lot of jargons and a lot of big language. I don't know if you are on social media, but you will see there's this famous comedian that usually uses a lot of big words in his sentences. And sometimes when you bring those words together, they mean nothing, or it doesn't make sense at all, right? So this is to satirize or to kind of, it's sarcasm, right? On the fact that some academics use big words, which is not really necessary because communication, when you write, is for purposes of communication, not to demonstrate your understanding of big words, right? So keep it simple as you can. But simple doesn't mean, this is where the contradiction comes in. Simple doesn't mean that you should use words that, for example, how can I put this? There's simple and not simple in academics. So if I were to use big words like flabbergasted, a lot of jargons in my writing, that really takes away because you don't have to use big words. However, you also don't want to use words that are not academic enough or formal enough, which takes us to the next one, right? You need to write in a formal way. And this is the contradiction, and that is why I put them close to each other, right? What is the difference between formal and using big words, right? To use big words, it's using those words that are not recurrently used in speaking and writing. But informal language, it's words that, are not sophisticated enough for formal writing. And please don't get confused. Let me give an example. So instead of saying give, use provided. Right? That is an example. So you will say provided instead of saying give. Instead of saying important, you can use, essential. You can use critical. These are other words that you can use in the place of important, right? Because important is so overly used. So another thing is informal language are things like varsity, your slangs. Varsity, you can say it when you talk in an informal setting, but varsity is not a formal word. Yummy is not a formal word. So you need to be able to differentiate formal and informal words and avoid using informal words in your writing. Now, I did mention choppy sentences when I said when you use short sentences that follow each other, those are what we call choppy sentences. Right? You want to be able to use complex sentences, compound sentences, and these are sentences where you will find your coordinative conjunctions, you will find your comma which, you will find your sentences that has a main clause and a supporting or subordinate clause. So, for example, you will change the sentence. The second element is the recommendation. Each recommendation consists of identification of gap. These are two choppy sentences, short sentences that follow each other. You could change this by joining these two sentences with a comma and which. The second element is the recommendation, which consists of the identification of a gap. So instead of having two short sentences, I have merged them to have a complex sentence, right? Now, note, we're not saying short sentences are wrong. No, they're not wrong. But if you have too many of them that follow each other, your work becomes choppy. So you want to mix them, have short sentences, long sentences, and so on. So you want to mix them, right? That is what we're saying when it comes to language. Collocations are words that often go together, such as communication style. So the words communication formal, for example, do not go together. So this is almost like your prepositional phrases that go together. So please note collocations, right? You need to learn them and get used to them the more you speak and the more you write. The next thing with your academic language is your academic language needs to focus on facts, guys. You don't want to be emotional. You don't want for it to be focused on your opinion. So you want it to be focused on facts. And that is why you want to support your arguments with academic references. Parallelism. It refers to the idea that there needs to be a balance or equal parts in a sentence, right? Let's look at the example. The managing director conducted the meeting fairly and with effectiveness. Now, the balance here is what? You're saying fairly with effectiveness. No, fairly is an adverb, so it needs to be effectively, right? The meeting was conducted fairly and effectively. You will not say the students were fair and unjustly, right? Or the students were fair and honesty. The students were fair and honest, because fair needs to take the same form as the next adjective that follows. So there needs to be the same form in terms of the adjective and the verb when you're listing them in the same sentence. Another thing is the passive voice. Try to use the active voice. Avoid using the passive voice. The employee was made redundant. The passive is often used when we do not want to emphasize on the doer and the action. The bill must be paid by the due date, right? We are more interested in the action as a result. So now when you are, for example, writing your AC, you want to mostly, use the active voice instead of the passive voice. So these are some examples, right? Joe slapped the boy, that is active. The boy was slapped by Joe. So instead of saying Joe slapped the boy, instead of saying the boy was slapped by Joe, rather use the active and say Joe slapped the boy. All right. Reporting verbs. This is when you use your references and you want to report. What you want to do with your reporting voice is. Your reporting verbs will tell the reader what your argument is in terms of language. If you're agreeing, you will use verbs like asserted, agreed, stated. If you're in disagreement, you will say you can use disagreed, argued, contrasted, and so on. So the reporting voice will tell the reader what that article means to you. Student voice, extremely important. When I look at a student's language, I specifically, when I mark, the student voice is very important to me as a marker, right? Simply because this is where I'm able to see that, you know what, you're able to analyze the information the way that you're supposed to do. So if you bring in, if your work from the first sentence you reference, second sentence is reference, third sentence is reference, last sentence is reference, there's no student voice. What are you saying? Please take this down in terms of language. Please, 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 guys. Big star, right? Nota bene. You have to start your sentences in your own voice, support it, explain it in your own words, then support it with references. At the end, your concluding sentence should be in your own words. That is how I know that the student has a voice in his writing. Keep your register formal, right? You want to maintain a formal register. I think I explained this already. No, I haven't. I think maybe in the essay. So wording your argument is also extremely important. And the last thing we're going to look at. So we say in essays, avoid using I. When you use I, usually it's not accepted in a lot of essays, except it's a reflective essay. So one of those essays that says narrate your own personal experiences. There's no way you will narrate that without using I. So in a reflective essay, you can use I. But in argumentative essays, you mostly use the third person. Yet avoid saying things like, in this essay, I will be discussing. Rather, you can name there are 3 ways in which, so you can name the facts directly, or you can say this essay discusses, this essay addresses, right? Avoid sentences like in this essay, or I chose this topic because. So the way you word your argument will also determine if your work is formal or not. But I said except is a reflective essay. If it's a reflective essay, you can use your I. We have come to the end of the presentation. We have looked at grammar in terms of punctuation, in terms of sentence structures, tenses, subject-verb agreement. We've also looked at different things to consider in order to keep your tone and register formal in terms of language. As I said at the beginning, there is so many rules in grammar, right? That is difficult for us to, cram these rules and know everything. So what you want to do is focus on those areas that you struggle with the most. That should be the things you focus on. Don't focus on the things you know already. Focus on those areas that you know. In my past assignments, the lecturer usually talked about commas, so I need to focus on the comma splices. My sentences, they always say it's too short, choppy sentences. My lecturers usually say I have incomplete sentences, sentence fragments, or I need to work on my punctuation. So you want to focus on those areas that you struggle. And if you were to book for consultation with me, you will see that the same thing. I pick 1, 2, 3 recurrent mistakes and ask you to focus on that. I will unlikely, tell you the grammatical rules and you need to identify all mistakes, because some mistakes are really because, you've written this work and you haven't really taken the time to edit it, not that you do not know about it. So it is unlikely I'll highlight a mistake that appeared once. I'll mostly focus on mistakes that are reoccurring, that appears a lot of times in your work, because then that will mean that is something you need to pay attention to. So pay attention to those areas that you struggle with the most. What I will do with the next grammar and language workshop is I'll try to bring in some text so that we can see identify some of the grammatical mistakes, some of the language mistakes. I will do that before we even start with the theory, because with each workshop, we usually have students that have not attended the first. So I will not exclude the grammar, but I'll try to, be faster and give an opportunity first for some practice to accommodate those who perhaps, need more practice. But if you're unable to attend, remember, you can book. Mr. Kagiso did share his email at the beginning of the session. So you can book for a one-on-one session with me where we can address your specific needs. Okay. We have come to the end of the workshop. Do you have any questions for me? Any comments? Any questions, any comments? As I mentioned, if you need a copy of the presentation, please email me and just introduce yourself and just request for the presentation, and I'll send it to you. Tomorrow is Thursday. Tomorrow, we're going to be doing one of my favorite topics, which is addressing multiple choice questions. Now, you will be tested using multiple choice questions as well as essays. So we have done the essay part. Please attend tomorrow because we'll be looking at the other way in which you'll be tested. So how do you prepare for your multiple choice questions? What are the best things to do in addressing your multiple choice question exams or tests, right? So please tomorrow look forward to attending the multiple choice, how to address the multiple choice, but also what are some of the learning barriers that you could find and how do you overcome these learning barriers, right? You're welcome, guys. You're welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend, and I will see you again tomorrow. Bye, everyone.